including Dr. Tracy Leavelle, who is a professor of history here at Creighton University and is director of the Kingfisher Institute for Liberal Arts and Professions. Ms. Misha LaPlante is the engagement manager of the Center for Indian Country Development at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank. And then our main panelist is, of course, Taylor Keene. Professor Taylor Keene, senior lecturer in the Higher College of Business. He is an MBA and MPA from Harvard, where he served as the fellow a fellow in the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. He's a citizen of Cherokee Nation, member of the Omaha tribe, and of course the author of Rediscovering Turtle Island, First People's account of the sacred geography of America. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Professor Taylor Keene.
Aho, ewila wangade, ijaje, wiwita bagija, umahambade, in Kesebe, Tom Wangadon. So I wanted you to get an introduction from me in the language of the Omaha people, Umaha, the people that move against the current. And our word for this land is Nibadaska, which means flat water. It's our translation of the Platte River. Once again, thanks to the Kingfisher Institute and to the Menard Family Center for Economic Inquiry for supporting this. It's been quite the journey getting here. People always ask me, how long did it take to write the book? Including a major delay during the pandemic with publisher, about 10 years. The point of this conversation tonight is I love doing these presentations, and I love the opportunity to combine themes. And the themes I want to discuss tonight is the intersection of mythos and economics. One of my favorite mentors in this space was Joseph Campbell, and his work is extraordinary. Why write this book? So, to the Siouan peoples, we have a prophecy around the 7th generation. And the origins of that story go back to White Buffalo Calf Woman, who brought us the ways of the Red Road and the pipe. And it was said that when she brought those things to us, she came carrying those pipes and singing those songs, and promised that she would return in her other form, which was as a true albino bison calf. Unfortunately, the tough part of this prophecy is tied to difficult times for indigenous peoples. So from the Siouan perspective, and many tribes have different stories about it. Algonquins have stories of the 7th fire. Our stories pertain to, unfortunately, the breaking of the sacred hoop of the Siouan Confederacy. So when we're looking back historically, we can't get around the fact, one is smallpox. Certainly guns, germs, and steel, but smallpox was the most devastating to indigenous peoples. And here in the heartland, actually, no one was immune to the variant of cowpox. Decimation rates were at least 50%, and here with the tribes in Nebraska, 85 to 95% of the populations died from it. At least 3 waves, probably 4 more realistically, beginning in the late 1700s, and the cumulative effect, for example, the Pawnees, who had been here for 3,000 years, started between 14 and 21,000, and we're down to 1,400. The Omahas, my ancestors, were over 3,000, down to 332. Poncas from 2,000 to 200. Combine that with ecocide of bison, elk, wolf, all of those are in our clan systems and an integral part of our structures. Not to mention changing of the landscape, introduction of European farming methods, all of that brought major, major change to the Americas in a very short amount of time. That was the beginning of that period. So the true defining moment that began the prophecy of the seventh generation was the massacre at Wounded Knee. And I was just looking through some notes around the time frame. L. Frank Baum, newspaperman, journalist, soon to become author of The Wizard of Oz, lived in Aberdeen at the time and wrote a series of shocking editorials at the time that basically was calling for genocide of indigenous peoples. And unfortunately, that racial animosity was a theme that was thought by many, many Americans. And from there started the 6 generations of suffering, and Lord knows indigenous peoples have suffered. The prophecy says that with the coming markings, the successive birth of 4 albino bison calves, this is one of them, that would signal the end to the era of suffering and the beginning of the 7th generation. First one was born in 2001, second one was, the fourth one was born in 2007. And I happen to be writing a scholarly paper with a Dakota spiritualist, a pipe carrier, who explained to me the true meaning of this. And all the children born after that time frame in 2007, they're the 7th generation. So for us as indigenous peoples, they will be the ones that we have to teach. And I, being of the 6th generation, need to become a teacher. And I was admonished at the time by my fellow co-author, who basically says, you're well educated in the Western ways, but you don't know all of your stories. And she was right. And so that began the journey for the book. The other important part of the 7th generation prophecy is all those children born after 2007 who are non-indigenous, they will be the generation who's finally ready for our wisdom. First question I wanted to answer, if I were asking the questions myself, is how long have indigenous peoples been here? There's portions of the book that discuss the barriers and the theories in the field of anthropology, which is a not very old science compared to others. But John Wesley Powell basically instituted the Bering Strait theory, that there would be nothing else than that. And it's been a pretty serious battle trying to push back further than that, but we have some pretty powerful evidence of footprints in limestone and white sands in Mexico that now pushes that back to 23,500 years, and hopefully we'll just go further. The other clue in how the book starts is the chapter called Cosmogenesis, and most of Algonquin-speaking, Siouan-speaking, and Iroquois-speaking tribes have some version of this. And in essence, it talks about our journey from the stars, from the Seven Sisters constellation that the Greeks called Pleiades, through the dark rift of the Milky Way, which is actually the pattern that I'm wearing today. And then we're guided by the morning and evening star, Venus, and our souls transmuted into animals. And depending on the tribe, they're different animals, except for usually they all have turtle, and one of the animals dives down into the primordial waters, brings up the clay, and gives it to turtle, who puts it on its back, and the land is born. So one of the questions I always get is, where is Turtle Island? And I say, it's the earth. And a lot of conceptions in Indian country think that it has to do with North America. It's to do with the whole world, but even more importantly, what I discovered in my research is that story is out of Siberia, and it's still there. So at whatever time point, 15,000, 23,000 years ago, that story came with us, which makes it even more powerful. I love sharing different variations of that story, and as I've shared the versions that I know, because both my tribes have those stories. But I love hearing other tribes say, Taylor, you almost got it right, but you got the wrong animal, or this or that and the other. The point is, it's such an old story that has so many different variations. So at the center of all that this is the Dark Rift, and at many of these sacred sites that I'm talking about, the Newark Works Complex in Ohio, Cahokia, you'll see the alignment of a lot of the earthenworks, especially on the evening of the summer solstice when it becomes vertical and rises out of the southern horizon. And it's our belief that a lot of these ceremonies would culminate with that, and ancestors would bring bones of recently passed people to these sites so they can make the pilgrimage. And in the case of the Newark work, it's called the Great Hopewell Road. And as one would walk from the Great Circle and Octagon at the Newark Works to Sugarloaf Mountain during the course of the night, this would rise up behind you over your head, the dark rift of the Milky Way. Of course, there was no light pollution like we have now, and you would see this above you, and you would walk with the journey of the souls, as above, so below. Vine Deloria's work has had a tremendous impact on me in the origins of this book, besides teaching the next generation, was to pick up where Vine left off. And I've since had the opportunity to spend time with his son, Phil, and visit with him about what his dad was interested in. And some of that's going to be in book number 2. But from reading all of these works, I really began to understand that at the core of indigenous religions is the land, and the land is the religion. An example would be Bear Lodge, much maligned in its settlers' name of Devil's Tower. Depending on the tribes, this is the base of the great tree of life, which I will get to, the Axis Mundi, the center of the universe. Many of the Northern Plains tribes, Lakotas, Kiowas, Cheyennes, and probably others, have this story of the 7 sisters whose brother consorted with the race of giants so much, and the giant's medicine power turned him into a bear, and he chased his sisters. Creator bade them to go to the great tree of life and to ascend there to save themselves from the bear, and from there they were ascended into the heavens to become the 7 Sisters constellation. A lot of battles right now are around this, trying to get the name changed of all these sacred places away from the newer names. One of the primary motifs of myth is the tree of life. This is a version, Dagian Sioux, the Osage, children of the middle waters. It speaks about the tripartite world, and you have the upper realm and the lower realm and the middle realm where we reside. There's a number of stars, but you'll see the morning star in there, the 7 Sisters constellation, and Venus. This is not too far from here, a place called Pahook, and it's a very special place. It is the place of origin for the Pawnee people. Their stories speak of it being the navel of the earth. In the time of giants, Creator instructed them to go underneath the ground into a cave for the Council of Animals, and there they rode out the flood that got rid of the giants. And when they emerged, Buffalo Woman led the animals and the people out at this place, and it's just outside of Fremont, Nebraska here, in a little place called Cedar Bluffs. And it's a ceremonial complex, quite large. It's up on a plateau pretty far above the Platte River in a serpentine bend of the river there. And most important to me and special is the Pawnee Tree of Life. They're typically bur oaks, but as the Pawnees were being forcibly removed out of their homelands of 3,000 years in the late 1870s, the elders had the infinite wisdom to take some of the young children to this most sacred tree and instructed all of them to place their palm at the base of the tree so they would know who they were. Nearly 45 years later, an ethnographer and folklorist was documenting these stories and found them confirmed through an individual by the name of Harry Madbull, who not only confirmed the stories, but went on to say, not only do I know them, I can take you there. And they did. And a small group of Pawnees returned in between 1915 and 1920. And story that was told to me by the Pawnees was when they went back up there, he was in his mid to late 50s at the time. And when he was there with the group of Pawnee, he instructed them to wait first so that he could go up first and touch the tree of life. And then he turned and says, now it knows me, and now because we're all related, it knows you. Another definition of sacred geography is where the lightning strikes, and this gives me a chance to talk about the true union of earth and sky and mythos and economics, and that is in the city that we don't know the name, but for lack of a better term, we call it Cahokia, which is outside of present-day St. Louis, intersection of the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Illinois rivers. And the city began to explode around 1050 and lasted until around 1350. It was the third largest city in the world at the time. And at the city center, which is, you're looking at an image of that, was between 15 and 20,000 people. In the outlying areas, which I love to call the suburbs, was 150 to 200,000. And it was the ceremonial site where certain stories were being shared. And yes, this image is theoretically what we think happened there. There was a very large cypress center pole put into the top of the Grand Mound there at Cahokia. And when they were excavating it and studying it, the archaeologists put a phone type pole in there, a telephone pole, not that long ago as a placeholder as they were studying how big the circumference was and probably how deep and how big the cypress tree, and it was massive. So as an axis mundi, as the center of the universe, the tree of life, even this telephone pole was struck so many times during the summer that they had to remove it. So we think that this was a culmination of the ceremonies. The chapter on Cahokia in the book, I decided to do historical fiction and came up with a character known as Honga, which is a very old and sacred word to the Gian-Suians. And I believe it refers to the one that we're all descended from. And the stories in the book discuss the dynasty of how this young individual came, found a place in society, and rose up through. And ultimately, his family dynasty saw the breakup of the legacy of Cahokia. The story that was being told there is basically a first father and his children. So first father and first mother, otherwise known as Mother Corn, or the woman who never dies. And ultimately one of the sons, in the Suian version, his name is Redhorn. And Redhorn takes a wife from the race of giants and produces the Thunder Twins. They have many different names: Hero Twins, Lightning Boy, Wild Boy, Earth Lodge Boy. And this is a good example here. This is where the syndication of the twins began, and these were very sacred pieces that were manufactured at Cahokia, and they were found at the Spiro site. So that was during the time period of Cahokia, but this is talking about first fathers whose journey took him to the lower watery realm, and he was killed by a water spirit. And eventually the twins come to reclaim his spirit, put it back in his body, and that becomes the story of death, rebirth, and ascension back to heaven. And this is an image of first father going back up. The hero twins, again, many different names. The Suian versions are Stone and Gray Wolf, sometimes called Flint and Dark Wolf. And many of the stories are about their adventures in the upper and the lower realms, fighting water spirits in the lower realm to bring back first father's spirit, as well as battles with the giants. The third spot I want to talk about is Picture Cave, which is where the Gian-Suians were at the time of Cahokia, somewhere 100 miles outside of St. Louis in the old site of Cahokia. And the real challenge with this is it has changed hands recently. And even though it documents these stories that I'm referring to from 1,000 years ago, it changed hands, and the new owners outbid the Osages and now bar anyone, including tribal people or academics, from going into the cave. And this is the paradox, unfortunately, that a lot of sacred geography is in. The same could happen at Pahuk. Right now it's in good hands. If that changed, we would know what would happen to all those things. This is an image of the twins battling the giants. You see the giant above, he has a big mace in his hand, and the forked eye design, which has to do with thunderbirds. They have big Mesoamerican type of headdresses on, and one carries the mace of power and the other carries the spear of destiny. Twins battling the water spirit. This one's kind of hard to see, but just remember that this is 1,000-year-old pictograph rock art. And probably most importantly is the Red Horn panel at Picture Cave, which shows one of the hero twins, or the father, Red Horn, carrying the head, which is what happened, why he lost his life to the water spirit. And by carrying the head back up to the upper realm, then the soul of first father would be able to be redeemed. So you can look at this, there's lots of interesting imagery, long-nosed god, mascots, etc., all have to do with the twins and the stories that goes along with it. The bladder type antler headdresses were to diminish some of their powers, which they had extensively, especially changing into upper realm beings or to water spirits. And you can look at it and say it's kind of funky looking, and I get that too, but here's what it really is. It's a star map. So Dr. Richard Dieterle's work, he's out of one of the University of Minnesota schools, and he's helped teach me a lot about how star maps were a part of everything. So again, union of earth and sky. Fixed stars of Orion's belt are a critical part of this piece. Pawnees have stories. There's an inverted deer on the right side. They have lots of stories about that. But our ancestors, whoever we are, look to the stars to tell the stories of creation, and we have the same. Trying to get finished here for the panel. The attendance QR code here, students who need to get credit. I'll leave it up there, and then we'll go to the next slide. Ask our panelists to join. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction to your great work here, and teaching us a whole lot of lessons.
That's a lot of information. I know that.
It is. So yeah, we'll go around the panel here and talk a little bit more about the book and about some implications for the book. Taylor, you just mentioned Picture Cave. I'm going to direct this question to Dr. Leavelle. Picture Cave, as you said, has changed hands recently, and there's some concerns that means that it's not available both for Indigenous peoples, to researchers and whatnot. And so Tracy, I wanted you to comment a little bit about Picture Cave and how that contrasts with how Native American art has been handled in other contexts.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. Well, first of all, I just want to say congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Tracy.
Such a great achievement, and I want to thank everyone for allowing me to be here and be a part of this conversation. So I think, as Taylor said, the situation at Picture Cave is very worrisome because it's emblematic of a long history of dispossession and colonization. And even when we have situations where the relations are good and people can visit sacred places that are important to their communities and cultures, it's always at risk. And at Picture Cave, we don't even, so the public does not know the new owners. The Osage tried really hard to negotiate a settlement that included payment for the property, but as Taylor said, we're outbid. What that means is that I'm a scholar, and one of the things I'm interested in is Indigenous religion. As a scholar, to me, it's terrible that we don't have access to those stories. But more importantly, is that the people whose stories are title of Taylor's book is Rediscovery, right? As he said in his account of the 7 generations, the 7th generation premise is built on the fact that there would be a period of difficulty. And to come out of that period of difficulty requires an ability to rediscover things. And if you don't have access to places like Picture Cave, then that becomes more difficult. And I can say more about the Jocelyn later.
Thank you. If Taylor or Misha, you'd like to chime in on this as well, on Picture Cave, feel free to. But if not, we can move on to trying to draw some connections between the historical stories that we've heard from Taylor and in his book, and what do we know about this? What implications do we have for today? There's certainly a growing understanding that knowledge embedded in tradition is essential for setting a path for the future. And so, Ms. LaPlante, if you could comment a little bit about how respect for customary and indigenous practices and institutions is necessary for economic development and progress today.
Sure. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be with you all today. Miigwech, thank you for letting me be here, and certainly congratulations on this wonderful book. I am just completely in awe. I think it's really amazing whenever an Indigenous relative can produce a piece of content that can live out and, I guess, have another life of its own, I guess, if there's more information that you might be bringing to it. So that's really exciting. The other thing that I'd like to say is that coming from the Center for Indian Country Development at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, the views that I express here are not representative of the Minneapolis Fed or the Federal Reserve System. And so just to speak a little bit more about how customs and respect for Indigenous cultures, right, are woven into kind of thinking about modern economic development. That is an incredibly important kind of opportunity for us to consider history as well as kind of like presence and the past. When I'm thinking of this, so as the engagement manager, that's one of the things that I and the others on my team kind of think about. So we have a whole engagement team at the Center for Indian Country Development, which takes great care to think about these types of things. And that's because we have seen, and kind of as Professor Keene had mentioned, that there has been a lot of trauma within Native and Indigenous communities, nations across the country. And so we really kind of need to slow down and make sure that we're taking a good look at kind of like how we're gonna be interacting with the communities that we're coming from, in part because of this mistrust, in order to build kind of the relationships that we need. And so when we think about that in terms of modern economic development, a lot of that has to do, at least with the Center for Indian Country Development, we think a lot about data. And so in order to get data, you kind of need to have the right relationships in which you can share the information. So kind of hot button topics that we often talk about, which are incredibly important, include tribal digital sovereignty or tribal indigenous sovereignty, data sovereignty, that kind of thing. And so when we think about those things, we're thinking about also how is the data governed and how is it being stewarded, how is it being protected, and how is it being shared. So when we kind of think about all of those things together, that gives us information about how we can bring the data to create stories, kind of not unlike this, but certainly kind of related to what do we know about the communities that we're a part of or that we're like hearing. And where am I going with this? I'm trying to say essentially that the data that we're creating is incredibly important, and we need to make sure that we have all of kind of the pieces in place to make sure that we're collecting that. So kind of another thing that we often talk about, for instance, is this thing called astric nations. So oftentimes Indigenous communities are left out of very important data sets, or might be left out of important research publications or that kind of thing. And so in order to make sure that communities are participating in that research, we have to make sure that we are kind of like reaching out to them and approaching them in the right way. So when I'm thinking about kind of the work that the Center for Indian Country Development does, one of the projects that we have that we're taking great care with right now is something called the Survey of Native Nations, which looks at tribal revenues and expenditures and tribal governments, specifically with tribal governments. And so tribal governments oftentimes are kind of very curious, about how the center is going to be using that data. And so then we have conversations with them about how we are going to use it, but also make sure primarily how do they want to use it? How do they want it to be protected? And so those are some of the things I'm thinking of when I'm thinking of modern economic development and respect and customs.
Thank you. Yeah, feel free to.
I just wanted to add something. A very wise historian and good friend who might be sitting on this panel told me that once you write a book, it's no longer yours because it has its own life. And I think I've already discovered that out already. And it is important, and I didn't realize at the time that there were so few voices like mine, Indigenous people telling Indigenous history and anthropology and cosmology. And it wasn't until Charles Mann, author of 1491, to whom my friend Tracy also introduced me, who wrote the foreword. We spent several different trips together. But it wasn't until he wrote the foreword that I realized that there weren't other books like this out there. And I think just like with owning the integrity of the data of our economics in Indian country, there needs to be more voices like this. I was inspired by, of course, Vine Deloria, John Trudell, but also Dr. A.C. Ross, who kind of Jungian psychologist who was a Lakota spiritualist. And his work came out just when I was out of college. All my relations, Matonkwe-on-Sea. And those things have been the inspiration. So I'm hoping there's young Indigenous people out here who say, I can write a book. I can pick up where people like Taylor left off, and hopefully there's another book or two in me. That's all.
I'm going to pass another question right back to you, Taylor. You talked a little bit about the journey that you had in writing this book, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that journey, and in particular, if you could tell us all a little bit about your Sacred Seed project, which has been seen right here in downtown Omaha.
Sure. Hardest thing I've ever done, best thing I've ever done. Just so much. I loved the research part of it. Writing was terribly difficult, even though I love to write, but writing something, when you're trying to create something that no one had ever really done before, was so difficult. I think the first month, my methodology was pretty simple. I pulled Hemingway every night. He used to chain himself to a chair. I didn't use a physical chain, but I would put myself in there for at least 2 hours a night, at least. And sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes drivel came out. After about the first 2 or 3 months, I could finally stomach to read some of the things that I wrote. And it just took a long time. The other challenge, the manuscript, I sent it to the first wave of publishers the week the pandemic hit. So nothing happened for like 2.5 years before I could get signed back up with. And there was so much consolidation during the pandemic. All these firms collapsed, amalgamated together. The firm that I signed, the publishing house, they're an amalgamation of 3 different firms. So incredibly difficult. So that's why it's so nice to get to this part of it. Editing was rough too, just months and months and months. I read the Audible book, which they did not want me to do, but I basically worked so quickly that they couldn't tell me no. So all of that was very taxing and very frustrating, but hopefully it will make effort number 2 easier.
It sounds like a labor of love for sure. So we've heard about a lot of the traditions, a lot of the ceremonies, and in the book, Professor Keene discusses the Calumet ceremony. But Dr. Lally, you've also done some work on the Calumet ceremony and in more recent contexts. And so could you tell us a little bit about what that ceremony is, and then how that ceremony or other rituals have mattered for the past and matter for today?
Sure. So the Calumet, to summarize, is the sacred pipe. And you should talk about the specific stories of that you share in the book, which are a little bit different. But if any of you have ever been in or around Pipestone in southwest Minnesota, there's an ancient quarry there. It's Pipestone National Monument now, and it's as part of the sacred geography of this continent. And there, it's the source of many of the bowls that are used in these sacred pipes that are then used in ceremonies with tobacco primarily. But as Taylor describes in the book, they're widespread across different peoples and cultures in North America, but it's always related to making connections, to developing authentic, human, and even other than human connections, and around ideas of peace and harmony and balance and things like that. So it's it continues to be an important part of Indigenous cultural ways in North America, and it plays a particularly important role in some of the work that you do in the book. I don't know if you want to
Sure, I can add a little bit. Yes, pipes are an important part of many tribal traditions for sure. And actually, Pipestone area, it's around where you all would know as Okoboji. Nice place, been a nice place for a very long time. Okoboji is the Dakota word for cattail, the cattail reed. And it's also another anthropological site known as Good Earth Che or Blood Run, depending on what perspective one comes in. But it's where the Omahas, Ioways, Otos, Hongas, and Arikaras were together somewhere 1400, 1500. And but the Calumet proper, they're pipe wands. They don't actually have a bowl, but there's elaborate stories. And that tradition came out of Cahokia, as did a lot of the sun dance and certain ceremonies, like the Morning Star ceremony of the Pawnee. And it's just been meticulous anthropological research to find all of these connections, but the impact of Cahokia was quite profound. Ultimately, that ceremony was an adoption and a fertility ceremony, and it literally was a nation-to-nation ceremonial exchange that stopped war. And one of the last versions was done between the Pawnees and the Omahas in 1883, and that's what the chapter in the book is. And I'll tell you, you got to read the chapter to learn more.
You know, one of the experiences that I had in reading the book was it exposed gaps in my historical knowledge and gaps in my knowledge about just the economic complexity of Native American history. And so, Ms. LaPlante, I'd like to ask you, I bet many folks in this room, I know I have gaps in my knowledge about the economic activity and economic complexity in Native economies today. And so I was hoping you could teach us a little bit more, tell us a little bit more about Native economies today.
Sure. So maybe some of you know, maybe you don't. There are 574 federally recognized tribal nations within the United States. That doesn't account for the state-recognized tribes or the non-recognized tribes, and that is just kind of a political designation that we're kind of giving, knowing that Indigenous peoples have a strong grounding in kind of wherever they're at. And so as I kind of think about this question, my point in bringing that into the picture is that there are 574 distinct economies on top of that, there are also state nation economy, or state tribal nation economies, and then tribal nation economies on that do not have the federal or state recognition at this point in time. And so there's great diversity across the country, which is incredibly exciting to see. And so some of the things that we're kind of thinking about at the Center for Indian Country Development are a lot about like, how do tribes diversify their revenues? How do they diversify kind of their portfolios and make sure that the tribal citizens, their community members, their relatives are getting the services that they need? And so oftentimes one of the things that we'll see, for instance, that our tribes will conduct their own tribal censuses, which give them the data that they need to inform the economic development projects that they want to see. Oftentimes they'll reach out to the different departments, for instance, within their tribal nation. So that could be their workforce development division, that could be their education department, that could be their child care department, just among the many kind of departments or divisions that they have. And then they'll really work with them to make sure that they are bringing both the services as well as the products, or just kind of the different kind of things that they need to the community. Some of the things that we hear often are housing, of course, is often needed, and housing in particular also for our elders or our seniors. And so we're really grateful to see those things. Another thing that we often see are cultural programs, language revitalization programs. At my own tribe, the Bay Mills Ojibwe Nation, for instance, one of the things that we did recently was that we had a tribal dugout canoe that was just launched on Gitchigami or Lake Superior, and we're very excited about that. And so it's incredibly diverse and very complex. Each tribe, again, is at a different place with where they're at. And one thing that's really beautiful that Professor Keene had pointed out in his book is that these economies have existed for a very long time and have morphed again and again. And both Professor Keene, myself, and the other Native students in the audience, or other Native folks, relatives in the audience, are all kind of reflections that these economies are working and thriving in a way.
Thank you. Professor Keene, to kind of keep on this topic here a little bit, I know that you've served as an advisor for the Omaha Tribe on economic development. Could you tell us a little bit about some of those experiences? And of course, you're an entrepreneur as well.
Sure.
So if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I've been blessed for the opportunity to serve both of my tribal nations. I served on the National Council for the Cherokee Nation for all of our at-large voters, which is the largest voter bloc. That was in 2006 and 2007. And when I returned back up here and began to work at Creighton, I helped revive our gaming efforts through a new economic development corporation, to which I was the chairman for 10 years. And we went from being basically $5 million in debt to cash flow positive and a couple million in the bank. And ultimately, it is the first step in diversification. The research for all this, and getting back to sacred seed and the role of farming, so sacred seed was basically, as I was studying what was happening in the past, you have to look at what we ate. And as tribal peoples, and then that centered around the three sisters of corn, bean, and squash, to which I was able to give some to our visitor. Omaha say that it's a blessing for the tribe, and visitors from other tribes come, so thank you for that. And all of these things, now we have an effort, a farm to school project. Actually, my dear friend and brother, former Creightonian Ricardo Ariza, is up helping with that program. And when I started Sacred Seed 10 years ago, there was nobody in my tribe who was interested in what I was doing. There were a couple people growing some of the corn, and I brought them some of the sacred varieties, a whole other stories that I had found of our original corn, and they weren't interested. Fast forward 10 years now, there's 8th graders to high school seniors that speak about food sovereignty and seed sovereignty, and they grow wonderful stuff up there. They have farmers markets, and they feed the elders at the elderly care, and things have changed so much. For me, that's the evidence of the 7th generation. The other lessons that I learned from writing this book about economic development is, when you look at those things like Cahokia, that totally dispels the myths of what people thought about
indigenous peoples on this continent that it was a vast wilderness. The reason it seemed to be a vast wilderness is because 85 to 95% of the populations died. And so besides things that we're learning from anthropology about farming methods, I hear all these things about regenerative farming, and 99% of them are indigenous ag things. But I'm glad it's all being done. But the main lesson for me is, even though Cahokia as a society collapsed, the lessons from it are still there, and the fact that it was a trading empire that went from copper from the Great Lakes to obsidian from down south, southwest, precious stones, east coast marine shells, the iconography, especially of the twins, but of the stories that I was sharing about the ascension, the death, rebirth, and ascension of First Father, that's what was monetized, culturally speaking, and in trade, and trade is currency. And so even after the collapse of Cahokia, basically it went from being sort of a dynastic, royal set of activities, including some of the sports that were played, chunky being the main one. Those things were no longer, they were no longer the intellectual property of the Empire of Cahokia, so all tribes got them, and you see the proliferation of iconography in ceremonial items all around with the twins and those stories. So those lessons can still help us today in thinking about, yes, regardless, we all have economies. And we need to figure out, and our stories were at the core of all of this. Stories are everything to indigenous peoples.
Well, and so many of those stories are preserved through art,
Yes.
and we've talked a little bit about Picture Cave. Dr. LaValle, I wanted to turn it back over to you to talk a little bit about the Jocelyn Museum. We were talking before about Jocelyn Museum has just reopened. You said that they've done some interesting things.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Jocelyn Museum, and I've told my students ever since I've been here, it's not that far, you gotta go.
You gotta go.
You gotta go. But it's been closed for close to 2 years or so. And that's for not just building a new gorgeous addition, and there's more space, and all of that. I went yesterday, but I think the most profound thing that they've done is they've completely reimagined their permanent collection in the American wing, and have fully integrated their incredible collection of indigenous art with the American story. So it becomes one more complex story, and also more interesting, and also, as I am a historian by training, it's more accurate, in the end. So instead of having a separate segregated room where you have native art and objects, cultural objects, it's all in one story. And so I really urge you to go to the Jocelyn and spend some time in the American wing and think about what that means to reorient your relationship to what we think of as the story of this continent. I am not aware of another major museum that has done it to this level, and there's just some objectively beautiful pieces to look at. It's totally worth it. So I don't know if you're going to have time to visit.
You should. You should.
Yeah, it's
If I
great.
can just add, Colin,
And
just echo, go
I
ahead.
just want to say, I should have said that Taylor and his uncle, were consultants on this. And so I think if we contrast it to Picture Cave, which is now off limits and is privately owned, the Jocelyn made an intentional effort to to make connections in the community and to get real feedback and put it into practice. I mean, I'm sure that wasn't always a smooth process, but serving as a consultant was, I think, important to getting that story told.
Yeah, I could just add on to that. By allowing Indigenous art to be shared with other American fine art, it finally puts Indigenous arts on the same equal footing of mutual respect as fine art to the public, which is the important part for me. Annika Johnson is the curator for Native stuff, and it goes back even further to when the chief curator is formerly Toby Jurvix.
Yeah.
Toby actually had me participate in the interviews for the selection of the job, so I had never heard anything like that. Annika's a genius, and I just love her work. Her discipline specialty is with Lakota stuff, but she goes into these communities. For example, one of Toby's efforts was to look at Carl Bodmer Show, who was the artist and botanist who went along with Prince Maximilian of Vide in the 1830s on their trips up and down the Missouri. And so that is, you know, the jewel of the Jocelyn collection, but the way that it was shared was not very much historically, very little of it. And so they had them all reconserved and then brought back out, and Annika did that show. And she had actually asked me at one point if I would write up some of the stuff, which was the first step. And I said, I can, but I will only speak to my tribal stuff. And I said, you need to let them voice for themselves. And that was just the beginning. That's all I ever said. And after that, it was all her. But introduced her to the Mandans, Gerard Baker, and there was a wonderful video. And probably more importantly, which you can see in the Jocelyn collection, is some of the artwork of the Growing Thunder family. And these were all tribes that Prince Maximilian and Bodmer visited on their trip, on their expedition. And it's just wonderful to see. There's the most gorgeous horse collar. Yes, a lot of tribes decorated the horses. That is a part of the new wing, and it is the most astounding piece I may have ever seen of perfection of quill work and bead work and hide work, and it's just stunning. And that whole family collective, there was a whole video that Annika did with that. So Jocelyn's really doing some forward thinking, and it bodes so well for the city of Omaha, because now we're getting all these things. Another object that's in there, very much a source of pride in my family, but I'm the 5th great grandson for Chief Big Elk, and there's a lot of things happening. Neighborhoods being named after Standing Bear and Big Elk, and him being honored and recognized in the Jocelyn. So lots of things have changed, all for the positive.
That sounds like an amazing development. We'll all have to check that out. I'd love to continue our conversation here, but I want to make sure we've got some time for questions and answers. So we'll turn this over to the audience. If folks have questions, please raise your hand. We'll have a microphone come around so you can ask those questions.
Hill and encountered a Pawnee. And then I thought, what would it be like as a Pawnee reversed to have ran into my great-great-grandfather for the first time? So anyway, a lot of interest in Americans. And I picked up some interesting Pawnee stories back in that area. But anyway, I'm a Golden Jay. So over 50 years ago, after leaving as a graduate of Creighton, I encountered Black Elk Speaks, the book, and that profoundly affected me in many ways. And part of it was the relationship of two mystics, Black Elk and Neihardt, and that whole encounter and how that book happened and stuff. And so, you know, one thing that you mentioned Young, and I was on the board for 40 years at the Neihardt Center, so pick up a lot of stories, but there was, the book was conceived in the 30s, but it was basically Dick Cavett. When he interviewed Neihardt, that book exploded. But what was, I did not realize or even think about, 30 years prior, where that book was. And it was Carl Jung. Carl Jung and his associates in Germany kept that book alive. So anyway, I guess what I'm kind of leading up to is my interest in Neihardt. You know, a couple quotes that just rang with me. Science will one day prove what the mystic already knows, and look for the patterns. And so I guess I'd be curious with all of you, any comments on those quotes, how that fits today with all the indigenous people, their knowledge, the stories. Again, that was science will one day prove what the mystic already knows, and look for the patterns.
Randy, it's nice to see you. I've enjoyed presenting at the Neihardt Center for a long time. Neihart's work as a writer, he is unparalleled, as a poet, unparalleled. Had that been today, hopefully Black Elk could have written his own book. Would it have survived without those relationships? Cabot and Young, probably not. So the lessons for me out of all of that is we need each other as people always. And it is a beautiful work. There's sometimes criticisms that it was, could have been editorialized. We don't know. As a spiritual indigenous person, what he shared with his dreams and visions is profound and mind-bogglingly beautiful. So thanks for sharing that.
But what a complex, he's an interesting person and an American product of all the processes that you're talking about, because Black Elk was also, I believe, a church elder. So, the version that you get in the most common public, edition of Black Elk Speaks does not even hint at the complexity of him and his life and his experience, which I think is the kind of story that you're talking about, or the kind of story that even the Jocelyn is trying to share now, that this is all intertwined. Does that make sense?
Thank you all for these important topics today. I personally do consulting with family prevention and community response here in the state of Nebraska, and I've had the wonderful opportunity to work with some of the tribal communities on assisting with data collection so that they can help tell their story and what their needs are for their communities. And it's challenging. Tribal sovereignty and data, Misha, I'm sure you see this a lot. Trying to build trust that they would get to control the data, because so often data in the past has been used against tribal communities. You go against, all the way back to the Dawes Act, where it was so inaccurate and so biased. And if you gave your data, your land rights were limited based off of blood quantum. There's just so many problems historically that has set us up to be poorly representing the true numbers, the true levels of what indigenous communities are. So building that trust, I was wondering if you could talk to maybe how you're addressing that with tribal sovereignty over their own data, and how you're trying to show that the data can help them versus being a window to control them like it has previously.
So I guess the thing that comes to mind first is trust takes time, as you probably well know. And so one thing that I think my team is very cognizant of, or tries to be very intentional and mindful of, is that making sure, or just having conversations with tribes, with our relatives, with our colleagues, is going to take a while, and that we can't expect someone to share their story, share their data right away. And so that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind. Can you ask maybe your question, the second part of your question again? Sorry.
Just how you're overcoming that, maybe success stories, and how you've seen either data used to help communities that they've now control, or some of the problems and challenges that you're still seeing that we need to work through to make sure that these communities lead the discussion and the collection and the management of that information.
Right, so I guess one thing that I want to say, thinking of like the survey of Native Nations that we're conducting right now, is to very much make sure that the tribe knows that the data is theirs, and it's not going anywhere else. And so I think our center is less about kind of showing them how the data can be used and more about like, what do you think that the data can do for you, and kind of how do you want to tell your story? I think everything should be situated, of course, as we know, with the relative or with the nation and the community itself first. And so really just opening up the conversation. I'm not going to say giving them autonomy, opening up the conversation so that they can kind of share what they're interested in responding to. And so when I think of kind of some of the success stories, we did have phase 1 conducted for the Survey of Native Nations, and we had a number of tribes participate with that. And thinking about some of the content or some of the kind of explanation that they gave as to why it was really important to participate in the survey was because it gave them an opportunity to share with funders, grantors, about kind of like how much they're investing in different areas within the community, but also how much they actually contribute to the economies around them. And so that was a really important part for these particular nations. And you can actually find some articles on our website about this project. In addition to that, I am thinking a little bit about some of the work that we do with Native community development and financial institutions, for instance. And so with that kind of work, we have a number of relationships that we've developed over the years. And again, this is just speaking to the longevity of it. So knowing that you can't just go into community one time, or you can't go into a community even 2 times. You really have to make sure that you're showing up again and again. And so when we kind of get the stories, or we hear the information, get the data from these places, it's really that we've done it over years. And so I guess that's kind of what I'd say. It takes time, and not just time, it takes years, and let's think long term instead of just one and done.
You actually answered my question with her answer.
I think we're pretty close to time here, and so I think panelists are still going to be around. Taylor's going to be here to sign books. Yeah, we can do one more for Bernie and wrap it up there. So quick question and answer, and then we'll certainly be available after for questions.
Regarding pre-colonial America, and of course what is now North America, what are some economic factors that sort of account for the geographic distribution of tribes around North America? And in other words, why are, I would have imagined these Winnebagos and the Omaha tribe would be going down and joining the Seminole tribe, where it's a good deal warmer and a little more congenial, at least in terms of weather. So what are some factors that account for this, economic factors that account for this geographic distribution, particularly in the northern tribes?
I can answer that. People always ask me what tribes were where, and my first question is, what time period are you talking about? So what we'll see more than anything else is constant migrations and adaptations of tribal groups and confederacies. So when you speak of the tribes that are in this area now that are all related, so the Sioux-Indians, for example, the Guians, 1,000 years ago we were together at Picture Cave. That didn't work out exactly the way that we thought it was, and so we moved. And that's where our names come from. Omaha means go upstream, Quapaw is downstream, Osage is children of the middle waters. The Kansas, which the state is named after Missouri, name of the state the tribe's after, we all separated. And so when you're really looking at the definition of time, though, I mean, there's no easy answer to all of that. It's just constant adaptation. What I would say is wherever you go in North America, Central America, South America, Indians live there. So This country is not yet 250 years old. Cahokia lasted 300, to put that in perspective. But tribal peoples have been here for tens of thousands of years, so the amount of stories and migrations, the multiplicity of languages here is mind-boggling. The variations of stories, how many times each of those tribal peoples moved. It's a tapestry that hopefully as anthropology goes deeper and deeper and deeper back in time, that we'll find out more of this. But sorry for the loosey-goosey answer, but it was very fluid. Arnie, thanks for the question.
But it's only getting more complex the more we know. So, like what we know economically and geographically, despite all the change that Taylor's talking about, is that every place was inhabited. Every place in North, Central, and South America. I think one of the most interesting things that I've been reading lately is the idea that the Amazon was this kind of sparsely populated place of water and little land, and now because of LIDAR, which allows you to look through the vegetation layers to the ground, they're finding that there are these complex urban centers with networks and roads and all these other things that no one knew about 10 years ago. We're only going to, I think we're going to push back in time, and we're going to also have a greater appreciation for the complexity at the same time.
Well, thank you all for coming this evening. If you'd like a copy of the book, we have free copies of the book, and Professor Keene will be here to sign copies of the book right out at the top of the auditorium. If you've got other questions that you'd like to ask the panelists, please come on down and we'd be glad to answer questions. Thank you.